Okay, we're going to do a Module 3 review to help go over the test for Module 3. So starting with our first question, if a right triangle has a hypotenuse of 15 inches and a leg of 17 inches, how could you use the Pythagorean theorem to find the missing side? And then what is the length of the missing side? So the first thing we have to do for this question, we can use the Pythagorean theorem to find the missing side by plugging in the values that we know. And that's the first step, is writing down the Pythagorean theorem and plugging in what we know. We know that the leg is 15, the leg is 7, which is why we've put it here for A, and the hypotenuse is 15, which is why we've put it here for C. Keeping in mind that the hypotenuse is always going to represent the letter C. So now we square the numbers that we have. When we square 7, we get 49. And when we square 15, we get 225. If we subtract 49 from both sides, that helps us get our variable by itself. So now we have b squared equals 176. If we plug that into our calculator and hit the square root button, that gives us 13.27. So b is about 13.27. That is rounded. So that would be our final answer. Another question you'll see on your DBA and your test is a word problem that you have to get the information from and solve using the Pythagorean theorem. So an example here, a house casts a 40-foot shadow. The distance from the top of the house to the far end of the shadow is 62 feet. If the house is perfectly straight and creates a right angle with the ground, how tall is the house? So something that helps here is drawing a picture. We know that the shadow is 40 feet, and we know that the distance from the top of the house to the end of the shadow is 62 feet. So this picture can help us visualize this. We have our Pythagorean theorem, and we're going to plug in our values. 40 goes in for A because it is one of the legs. We are looking for the other leg, which is how tall the house is, so we're going to leave B alone. And then the hypotenuse of this picture is 62 feet, so we plug 62 in for the letter C. We square 40 and we get 1600. We square the number 62 and we get 3,844. We subtract 1,600 from each side to get our variable by itself, and we're left with b squared equals 3,244. If we put that into our calculator and hit the square root button, we are given 47.37 feet. Again, this is rounded to the nearest hundredth place. So that should be fine, because sometimes when you square root a number that's not a perfect square, you're going to get that irrational number that has decimals that go on forever. So usually cutting it off at the hundredth place is perfectly fine. Getting into the coordinate plane, how do we use the Pythagorean theorem to find the distance between 2 points on a coordinate plane? So we turn it into a right triangle by drawing 2 legs that connect these 2 points. We count how many spaces these points are away from each other, paying very close attention to our units. Our graph here increases by 1, so each of these lines is worth 1 unit. Sometimes your graph will increase by 2 or 5 or 10. So it's really important to pay attention to the units that the graph is drawn in so that you can have an accurate number. All right, so now we have our 2 leg measurements, and we have our hypotenuse. This is the distance we are looking for. This is the distance between these 2 points. So we can plug in our leg values of 4 and 6 into our equation. Now we're going to square these 2 numbers. 6 times 6 is 36, and 4 times 4 is 16. Now because both of these numbers are on the same side of the equal sign and we already have our variable by itself, we don't subtract at this point, now we add. And the difference between this and the previous two examples where we had to subtract was because our goal was to get the variable by itself. In this equation where you're looking for the hypotenuse, your variable already is by itself, so you're going to add your two numbers together. So 16 plus 36, you add those together, you get 52. You find the square root of each side, and you get 7.21 equals B. So the distance between these 2 points is 7.21 units. Later in Module 3, you learned about finding the volume of different shapes. Starting with a cone, if your cone has a radius of 9 inches and a height of 14, what is the volume? It's really important before you take your DBA and your test to make sure you have your volume formulas handy. There will be quite a few questions involving volume of various shapes, so make sure you have those formulas ready to go. Solving this problem is easiest when you write the formula first, and then you plug in the parts of it that you know. We don't know volume, so that's going to remain as a variable. We know that pi stands for 3.14. We know our radius is 9, so this will say 9 squared. And we know our height is 14, so that's going to say 14. So we plug in all those values. Now we have to square the 9, that's our first step, and we get 81. Now we have to multiply these three numbers together. It doesn't matter what order you do it, you just got to multiply all three of those together, and you get 1,134 for these two. Now I'm going to multiply 1,134 times pi, and I get 3,560 and 76 hundredths. Now, when you're multiplying a number by a fraction, if the numerator is 1, which it is, for this problem, we only have to divide this number by the denominator. And that only works because our numerator is 1. Technically, to solve a problem like this, you would have to multiply 1 times this number and then divide by 3. But because any number times 1, the answer is that number, you don't have to go through that step, you just have to divide by 3. In other formulas, your numerator is a different value, it's not 1. Like the volume of a sphere, for example, the numerator is 4. So you would have to multiply by 4 first and then divide. But because this is a numerator of 1, it doesn't matter, you just divide by the denominator. So plugging this number into our calculator and then dividing by 3, we get an answer of 1,186 and 92 hundredths. And then that would be our final answer. Alright, our last example, a beach ball is filled with 1,436 cubic inches of air. What is the radius of the beach ball? So this example is the opposite of finding the volume. This, you've already been given the volume measurement, and that is 1,436 cubic inches of air. And you're going to use that number and the volume formula to find what the radius would be. So again, the first step is always going to be to write the formula first. That's always going to be your first step. Now we're going to plug in what we know. We know the volume, so we plug that in. We know the fraction 4/3. We know what pi stands for. We just don't know what the radius would be. So we're going to leave that as a variable because that's what we're looking for. So we filled in all of these things. Next, our step is going to be to multiply these two numbers together. 4 thirds times 3.14. To get that, we're going to multiply 4 by 3.14, and then we're going to divide it by 3. And then our final answer is 4.187. Now, if you've done any sort of work with equations before, we know that the goal is to get the variable by itself. And if you haven't worked with equations before, just hang tight because we do work with equations a lot in segment 2. But this might be confusing if you haven't worked with them before. So just the best thing to do would be to write down the steps and then to just try a lot of practice problems, and then that will get you used to working with it. But when you have an equation with a variable and you want to get the variable by itself, you have to do the inverse operations until that variable is by itself. And inverse just simply means opposite. So in this example here, 4.187 is being multiplied by by r cubed. Now when you're multiplying two numbers and you want to split them up, the opposite of that would be division. And in an equation, if you divide one side by a number, you have to divide the other side by that number as well. It's called balancing the equation. You have to make sure it stays equal. So if you divide each side by 4.187, you get an answer over here of 342 97/100. And over here you're left with r cubed. Now your last step, what you need to do is you find the cubed root of each side. And your answer is 7. So r, or your radius, would be 7 inches. Okay, and that's my last review example. There are lots of other review questions that you can go over inside of the module. I would recommend, if any of this seems still a little bit difficult for you, I'd recommend going over some more examples in your lessons and some of your problems in your assignments. Possibly look into your gradebook, see which lessons you have the most difficulty on, and go over those questions and see why you got those answers incorrect and see what you can do to fix it. Doing that is a great review for your test. That just helps to make sure that you don't make the same mistakes twice. And as always, if you have any questions at all, please feel free to let me know. I'll be happy to work through some problems with you to give you some insight on how to solve different types of problems, especially if you're struggling with a concept. Please let me know. But until you have any questions, keep working hard and keep up the good work. Let me know if there's anything I can do to help. Have a great rest of your day.